Hello there and welcome to the Card Grotto. Today I've got a card to share with you creating soft watercolour flowers. So let's get started. This is the Altenew Crafter Flower Fragrant Peony Layering Die Set. It's so beautiful. There are 2 flowers in it with lots of different layers that you can layer up. The flower centres and then also some leaves as well. So I'm going to die cut the flowers and the leaves from Altenew watercolour paper. I just wanted to show you here, in case you're not familiar with the Crafter Flower series from Altenew, when you die cut the flowers, they cut with a shape in the centre so that you can line them up really easily, and I'll show you that a little bit later as we line them up. But for now, I'm just wanted to show you that there's either like a keyhole in the centre or an arrow. So I'm placing all of the dies here down onto the watercolour paper. This watercolour paper is labelled as cold press, but to me it is definitely more of a hot press watercolour paper. It's really quite smooth and lovely to watercolour on top. So I'm just arranging the flowers and the leaves on top of the watercolour paper. Then I can hold them down with some low tack tape and run those through my die cutting machine. To colour the flowers, instead of doing my usual ink blending, I thought that I would do some soft watercolour on top. So I'm taking 2 packs of the Altenew Jewel Tip pens. These are a water-based pen. You can use them in lots of different ways. So they've got a brush tip on one end and a fine tip on the other end, and you can use them, because they're water-based, you can use them as kind of like a watercolour pen, which is what I'm doing today. So I've taken the Tahitian Terrace set and the Islands of Fiji set, and I'm going to do some of the flowers in more of like a purpley bluish tone and some of them in a pink tone. So I've scribbled on some of Eastern Sky. This is from the Tahitian Terrace set, and I'm mixing that with a little bit of water and picking that up with a size 4 round watercolour brush, and I'm just dabbing that onto the petals. As you can see, I'm not particularly being very neat at this stage. Well, in actual fact, at any of the stages I'm not being particularly neat, because I wanted a really soft look. So I dabbed that colour on first, and now I'm going back in with just some clean water and trying to blend that out, because I don't really want all of the petals to be completely covered with the colour. I want there to be some white areas, because I do want them to be quite light and airy. So you can barely see this colour at this point. I do go in with another layer, but I do like to add the colour in layers basically, because I want them, like I said, to end up quite soft. So I'm going in with kind of like a wet on dry technique. A little bit later I go in with more of a wet on wet technique to have the colours blend together. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of that blue onto the petal here on the right hand side, and then for the centre it cuts 2 centres. It cuts one kind of like underneath with that keyhole so that you can see where it's going to be placed, and then you add another one on the top, so I only need to add colour on that top piece. So I'm going in here and adding a little bit more of a concentration of that blue colour. But again, I do go back in with the clean water to try and blend out the edges. I don't really want too many harsh edges that you can kind of get with watercolour. I want them to be, like I said, quite pale and sort of airy. So I'm just going in here, adding a little bit more in. I'm kind of going for a little bit more of kind of like a mottled look, if that makes sense. So I'm now going in with Hydrangea, and this is more of a purple tone. I wanted the kind of flowers to look, I guess, more of sort of, like I say, a purpley bluey rather than just straight up blue or straight up purple, and I think these 2 colours work really nicely together. So I'm again just dabbing in that purple. Again, it looks really messy at this point, but I do go back in with a clean brush and try and blend the colour out a little bit. But like I said, I do really love these colours together. I think they look nice again on their own, but this kind of like tone, the blue tones down the purple a little bit, so it's not so kind of pink toned purple. Definitely ends up being more of a blue toned purple. So here I'm going in with that clean water to blend out those edges, and it does end up being quite nice and soft. And then here I'm going back in with that purple just to deepen that colour slightly. And here you can see that because I'm going in with a wet on wet technique, so that the paper is already wet, when I add the colour on top, it's just going to blend together and I don't have to then blend it myself. And it does end up, like I say, with more of a bit of a mottled look, but I do quite like that look. So once I've fiddled around a little bit more with this, I do end up going back in with a little bit more purple again. It is really difficult, I find, with loose watercolouring to not kind of fiddle with it. It is best, I think, to kind of walk away at some point and just let it do its thing, and it does tend to look really nice at the end. But because I tend to be more of a kind of clean and simple crafter, I do find more of kind of like a loose watercolour a little bit more difficult for me. So now I'm going to work on the pink flowers, and I'm starting off with Pink Pearl, and this is a really, really pale pink. It's more of like a corally pink, I suppose. So I'm kind of going in with my first layer of this first, and I do end up having to add quite a lot of that pen onto my kind of watercolour palette here and mixing that with water. You can definitely go in straight with the pens, but because I wanted a lighter look, that's why I'm kind of dabbing those onto the watercolour palette and then picking it up with the brush. So now I'm going in with a darker shade, which is Coral Berry, and this definitely does have more of a coral tone to it, but I didn't really want the colour, the kind of flowers to look coral. I wanted them to look a bit more pink, so I'm going in with that purple, that hydrangea colour, just adding a little bit of that, and it's just toning down that kind of orangey side to the pink a little bit better. So again, I'm just fiddling a little bit with these, try and blend those out. And then for the leaves, I'm using Bamboo and Grassfield, and these are from the Islands of Fiji set. And because I want to mix these colours quite well together, I'm just going to add them basically pretty much at the same time. So I'm kind of going in first with the lighter shade, which is the Bamboo, and then I can kind of blend that out a little bit with the water again, and then I can go in with the Grassfield and just kind of dab some of that on. And I'm not too concerned if these look a little bit messier than the flowers. Most of it is going to get covered up, but I quite like how they turned out in the end, actually. Kind of like some white areas on these as well. And if I get a little bit too much colour where I don't want it, I can just go in with a paper towel and dab some of that up. I then want to create a banner for my card, so I'm taking the Altenew Terrific Tags die, and this is my favourite tag in the set. It's the largest size and it's got that lovely fishtail kind of banner at the bottom. So I'm holding the die down onto some white cardstock with some low tack tape, and then I'm going to run that through my die cutting machine, but I only want to cut the bottom part of this tag. I don't want to cut the top part. So I'm going to place the top plate in my die cutting machine towards the bottom, so anything under the plate will cut and anything on top of the plate won't cut, and this is a great way to do partial die cutting. So I've run that through and you can see that it's just cut the bottom part. So I can cut the bottom part off with scissors. It's just a little bit easier for me to see where I need to cut. And then I can bring that over to my guillotine and I'm going to cut the two sides down. I did end up cutting a little bit off of the banner as a whole, but that's fine as long as I make sure that I cut it kind of even on both sides. And I'm just using a mini guillotine here. I find this the easiest way to cut this down. I did end up having the banner longer than I needed it to be, but it's a little bit easier for me to cut it down if I need to. So I'm just bringing it to my card base here and then marking the two sides so that I can see where I need to cut it down, and then I can just cut that down with the guillotine as well. I'm then adding some foam tape onto the back of this banner piece. I can remove the backings and then I can adhere that down onto an A2 size white card base. So that's a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. And this is just going to give me kind of like a grounding for my flowers to be on so that they're not kind of just floating in the air. Although to be honest with you, I kind of do that quite often and I do think it looks okay. So now I'm going to assemble my flowers. So I've added a little bit of liquid glue just around where that keyhole is, and then I can lay them one on top of each other, and you just line up that keyhole. It's really easy to do. And so for that center, like I said, you've got that keyhole there, and then this one you can just line up on top of each other, and it just takes a little while just to make sure that I'm lining each piece up properly. So that is my first flower done, and I'm just going to manipulate the petals a little bit, kind of lift them up a little bit at the edges, just to add a little bit of dimension onto the flowers and make sure that they're not so flat. And then I can just do the same thing with the pink flower. So this time I've got that arrow that I'm lining up in the center. And then I can just pop that centerpiece on top. I've then got my elements here, so I'm just figuring out where I want them to be placed before I stick anything down. So I'm just using the 2 leaves here, and then I can pop the flowers on top. And I am going to end up having that flower there on the top left overhang the card base. I could have cut the card base down so that it fitted inside of a standard sized envelope, but I kind of forgot, to be honest with you, so I didn't think of that at the time. But I do really like having elements hanging off of card bases. I just quite like the look, but obviously I don't necessarily need to. I could have just moved it further over, but I probably would have moved the banner further over as well so that it fitted a bit better visually for my kind of purpose. So I'm adding all of these leaves and flowers down with liquid glue. I already thought that they were quite dimensional without having to add any more foam tape onto the back of them. So just kind of placing them down, and then because I don't want to add anything heavy over the top of this, because I've already kind of folded those petals up, I did just hold them down for a little while with my fingers just to really make sure that that glue sticks well. I've then heat embossed a sentiment from the Altenew Soft Blossom stamp set. This is one of my favourite sentiments. I love the font on this set. So I have stamped that down onto some black cardstock and heat embossed that sentiment, and I'm just using a T-square ruler here to help me out with the placement so that I can try and add this on straight. So I'm kind of just hovering it in place to start with, and then once I'm happy I can press that down. And because these flowers are really quite dimensional, the sentiment really just ended up being kind of stuck down to the flowers rather than stuck down to the card itself. So it is kind of hovering a little bit. So that was a little bit more difficult for me to try and get it straight, but it is really well stuck down. So it's not going to come off or anything like that. I then did just finish it with some iridescent bubbles to add a little bit of sparkle onto the card as well. And I really like how it turned out. I do like those flowers with the kind of soft watercolour look. I did practice this card in advance, and I think I prefer the watercolouring on the first card. I think I got a slightly deeper shade of the purples and blues, which I really liked, but I do prefer the pink flower of my original one. So of the second one, excuse me, it was a little bit kind of darker than the first one, but I still think they're both quite pretty. And like I said, I really liked using those pens as a watercolour medium. Links to the products that I used are listed in the description bar on YouTube and also over on my blog. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.